and then we'll get through the housekeeping. We've got a lot of people very promptly joining, which is really fantastic to see. I can only assume the reason for that is almost everyone in the room is an IT professional.
I think almost everyone in the room likes tequila, actually.
Ah, that's probably what it is.
No, we have to drink because we are in IT. That's why.
Isn't that the truth?
Kevin Bartlett, are you an IT professional?
I'm trying to
Asking for a friend.
Oh,
Hi, guys.
there's
Hi,
always
Kev.
one. Welcome, Kevin. Right, we are looking good. This is a great turnout today. So thank you, everyone. I think I've been seeing some people that are barely late, but we're still adding people. But let's not keep the people that have arrived on time waiting any longer. So thank you all. I'm assuming you all have a very interesting little box of tequila next to you. And I know that some of you have joined us for some of our other events. So good to see those of you again. And those of you that haven't done one of these remote virtual events with us, I hope you really enjoy it. But we've had some great success with them in the past. We've had a wine event, which was interesting. Some of us remember it more fondly than others. But our guest speaker had some technical issues. And had a blazing fire behind him, which was quite interesting. He could man a fire, but he couldn't necessarily manage his computer very well. But it was still great fun. I'm sure some of you remember that. And following that, we've had some whiskey events and some others, which have all been very well received. So you guys will meet the group from the Whiskey Rebellion. So they'll be joining us later, and they'll be taking us through the tequila tasting. They do a great job. They give you a little history of the grain, of the spirit, and how it's made. And they've really kept some people interested, which is awesome. And they'll generate some interest in the liquor as well, which is cool. So we'll get to that eventually. But first and foremost, we're going to be getting through some very insightful things from Lee. So Lee can give us a wave. He's going to be speaking to us all today and giving us some background on cybersecurity, what the current issues are worldwide, where AI plays a role in that, and how it will continue to, some mitigation, and all centered around a product that we're quite proud of, and we've rolled out a few times, and that's doing some really wonderful things for some of our customers that are currently running it. So there's not too much housekeeping. Obviously, all of you are sitting at home or in your office, so I'm assuming you know where the bathrooms are, so I don't need to point those out, nor do I need to touch on health and safety. Perhaps we'll get to that later after some tequila. So I think, sometimes when we tackle these events, well, let me first introduce myself. I'm Aaron, to those of you that I haven't met. I'm the Chief Services Officer here at Turrito. We've also got Brian on the call, who is our CEO. And then we have a bunch of team members. I'm not going to introduce them all. Most of them have their cameras on, which is great. I'm sure some of them are familiar faces for you guys. So hopefully you recognize your AM out there, or one of our senior SWAT engineers, as we call them. And our SWAT guys are really our high-level implementation and project experts. So if we've implemented something for you already, you would have seen these guys. Or if you're a prospective client for us, you will be seeing them, and they'll be taking you through some pretty cool things that we can do. So that's the team you see before you. And usually what we do is we like to touch on an example around the product that we're showcasing and around the risks. But what's interesting about cybersecurity is nobody wants to talk about cybersecurity, rule number one, and nobody wants to talk about an event that they may or may not have suffered. So that being said, it's difficult to give a relevant example. But in sort of thinking about that, what it made me realize is pretty much all of the statistics that we'll be seeing now from Lee and that you can find out online are inherently below what they should be because nobody wants to volunteer that they've been a victim of a cyber event. So as scary as those figures might seem to you, it's a pretty logical conclusion to realize that they're significantly lower than they should be. Because especially in the SMB space, nobody's volunteering that they've been a victim. Obviously, once your organization gets larger, and if you're being audited or if you're needing to speak to an ombudsman or a data regulator, they're going to find that out. And of course, legislation has now caught up. So certainly if you're exposed to customers in Europe, you're having to deal with that. And now in South Africa, we obviously have our own concerns. But first and foremost, whether or not you're worried about the government rocking up and looking at what you're doing, you open yourself up to some pretty serious civil risk and civil liability if you're not doing what is considered reasonable for an organization your size. And again, so just to, I think, somewhat introduce everyone else in the room, what's quite nice is almost every single one of you is an IT professional in your organization, which is great. So that's the room we have, and Lee knows that, so he'll be sort of positioning his talk accordingly. And once we go through that, then we'll cut over to some Q&As. We've already done a dark web scam for a lot of you. So scan. I did end that with an N and not an M. So for those of you that have seen that scan, hopefully it's piqued your interest and you can ask some questions. But really anything. Lee's a wealth of information and is significantly skilled at this stuff. So please feel free to raise your hand and ask a question when we wrap up. All right, Lee, over to you.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for passing over. I'm going to share my screen and we should get a presentation up. Everyone see that? Yeah, getting nods, great. So going to run through a presentation today to talk about cybersecurity, the threats and cyber resilience. And just speaking to my background briefly, I'm a certified information security manager, which means that I specialize in the information security side, the governance, the auditing of cybersecurity. But I also work for a channel vendor that supplies services, supplies SOC operated endpoint protection. So we get very familiar with the threat hunting side of things, the tools, the technology behind it as well. So this is going to be a bit of a mixture of everything. But yeah, just wanted to give you that background, and I spent quite a long time in this space already. In terms of the topics for today, I think Aaron covered it pretty well. We're going to touch on a few things. We're going to set the scene with some of the landscape. We're going to have a look at AI. AI's got a hot talking point. What is that doing to the threat landscape? What does that look like? What should we be thinking about? We'll have a look at some of the security factors that are increasing risks out there, potential costs of cybercrime, what happens when things go bad, what does good look like. Then we'll talk about how we can secure to these principles and things you can follow up with today. So I'm going to start off and we're going to look at the cyber threat landscape. So a cyber threat is any potential risk to your cyber infrastructure that somebody could attack you with. So when we're talking about cyber threat landscape, we're talking about anything that can impact your business, your assets, your people, your technology, basically everything that goes towards making your company run. Now, that threat landscape has increased because how we run our companies has changed. And there's been a progression from remote work from home during COVID, which saw a vast increase of technology changes, saw a vast increase of risk. So any rapid increased technology change always increases your attack surface. There's always opportunities for people to compromise that. And the next slide sort of gives an example of why that might be, because the technology stack we've got to look after is a lot wider than it used to be. We've got data centers, we've got cloud, we've got remote home from workers, we've got IoT, we've got OT, and we've got all the SaaS-based products. We're facing another big tech change right now, and we're going to see similar risks. So when we saw COVID, we saw tech change on the sort of ratio of about 10% of everybody's technology changed pretty much overnight. Most years, only about a couple of percent of people's technology on average is changing. So we saw a rapid change. We're going to see a very rapid change with, you'll probably guess what it's going to be, AI. And AI is going to, and specifically generative AI, we're going to see benefits and we're going to see risks, and we're going to see them all at an accelerated level. I think we're seeing a lot of that play out at the moment. So a little piece of background. So whatever we're talking about, we're talking about generative AI. So we're talking about things like the Da Vinci's, the ChatGPT, Google's Bard platform, Bing, which has included its own generative AI module within it, and things like Copilot to help with coding. All of these tools have had a huge uptake in people signing up to them. There's been a lots of interest. Now they're providing anything from generative images and like Da Vinci. They're providing sample code, writing essays, providing research, and the more scary side, simulating people's voices. Now, AI is everywhere, and there's big money behind it. You've got the likes of Microsoft back in this. You've got the likes of Google back in this, and whatever happens, they are all in. They've invested on this. So the technology has landed with a bang, like it or not. So the result of this is people are going to use it with or without our permission. Yeah, I think it's when we do a sort of survey of people, and I've done this in the room before, maybe a show of hands, who has used generative AI in their company? Yeah, one or two hands, yeah. Now, who has used generative AI outside of their company? Yeah, a lot more hands, right? And this is typically what we're getting at. So whether you have an intention to use AI or not, people will use it. You know, it's interesting. There's something going on here. We all want to see what's going on with AI. Now, what that leads us to is we've got to think about the people, because AI can be used maliciously. We know that it can be used to automate and improve the efficiency of known attacks, but it can also be used positively. So we know AI can be used to prevent attacks. It can also be used to improve the efficiency of our day-to-day working and practices. And with any big tech change, we're going to expect there's going to be an increase in those threats, both in the quality, how convincing those threats are, and the quantity as well. Most immediate risk, it's going to be the people. It's going to be the accessibility of AI and what that brings to your business. If I can tell you anything to take away today in terms of AI, it's going to be thinking about guidelines for your employees. Like I said, people are going to use this whether you want to or not. Providing guidelines to employees is going to promote responsible use. If you completely restrict it, it's not going to work, because people can use it in their everyday life. Yeah. So people are going to be using AI whether you want them to or not. Now, there are some things that you need to educate people on. So don't avoid the question, look into it. Things like don't allow any of your corporate data onto public AI platforms. Now I've put a little note there, just ask Samsung. And reason being is Samsung did this recently, and a bunch of their developers and engineers shared some information around their chip designs and used generative AI to provide some information and some research for them. That research, those designs, as soon as they hit the public platform, they became property of OpenAI. They didn't own them anymore. The intellectual property is in their small print. You use the public platform. Anything you share in there, it's their intellectual property. Now, there has since been a reaction. Samsung obviously got very frustrated with this, got into talks immediately. And since then, I believe the data has been returned. They've also, ChatGPT, OpenAI have included the ability to do things like right to be forgotten, right to have some of that data removed, but it is only for their paying customers. Yeah, so there are people, they are thinking about some of this kind of stuff, but the point is the risks are still there. Now, don't assume that AI generated responses are fact. Basically, without going into huge detail about how AI works, it's essentially a probability engine. It's looking at all the possible scenarios and matches to the thing you're asking it of, and it's finding the most common response. Key word here, most common response, not most factual response. Yeah, if everybody is saying the same thing and they're saying the moon is made of cheese, and you do a search to see what's the moon made of, it's going to tell you the moon is made of cheese. And it's going to do it very convincingly because it's going to find the most convincing piece of information it can do. So you've got to understand that the way it works, what you're getting back is not necessarily going to be accurate. It's just what is popular opinion on the internet. With that in mind, it's a very good time to educate your employees on how to do fact checking. Yep, so there are websites out there where they have investigative journalists, and they will look for and determine whether things are fact. So things like Snopes, for instance, there's a website that does that. There's a number of others as well. They're typically independent bodies, and that's what you want to be looking for. And they research popular things that crop up on the internet. Other uses and forms of generative AI, I quite like the Bing one, because what that does is it actually tells you where it got its resources from. Gives you the top 4 results where it's got its answer from. So you can go and check yourself and go, right, that looks like a convincing article. Right, I'm going to go and see where that came from. And you can do a little bit of research yourself. On that same side of things, always verify code or automation generated by AI. I saw a very scary podcast, I would say, and it wasn't scary because of what was happening. It was scary because it was a leading developer, someone very experienced in his field, very, very senior, saying that he was using AI to audit his coding. Now, remember that thing I just said, don't assume that responses are fact. How can you use a tool that just replies the most common answer to audit your code? You don't know that the functionality is right. If I was a threat actor and I managed to manipulate the search response by posting a whole load of malicious code, it may well be that the code you get is completely malicious. It's not a good platform for auditing. It's not a replacement for people that understand what they're doing. It's an efficiency tool. A very useful efficiency tool, and it can make coding better. Using Copilot, you can get quicker, more reliable coding, but it's not a replacement. And also, you've got to test things as well. You know, part of automation is understanding how it's going to impact your company and what's going to happen. These types of things are things should be thinking about guidelines for your company, so that people are a little bit forewarned, a little bit forearmed that if they're going to think about generative AI use cases, they're going to be thinking of some of these principles. It's also worth pointing out that legislation is changing by the day. I've been following and tracking the legislation going on. There's an AI Act in Europe. Yesterday, Sam Altman, the CEO of ChatGPT, got in front of the Senate and said, I'm really concerned. I need more laws to protect the US citizens. This is the CEO of ChatGPT telling the US Senate that he thinks the generative AI product that they've helped develop isn't safe. That tells you everything. Yeah. There is legislation going on as well, which is even more strict in its narrative, but it can be safe. We just got to remember that we can't just allow this to run rampant through our businesses and potentially do what it likes, because you have no control over it unless you're putting some guidelines in place. So that was my piece on AI, and any questions do ask later, and we'll move on to some other stuff. Now, I work for a company called ConnectWise, and we are a software and services vendor, but we work predominantly with small companies, small to medium-sized businesses, MSPs, and we want to understand what are the pains and problems that you're experiencing. So every year we survey around about 700 small to medium-sized businesses, so 10 to 1,000 employees. And we ask them a whole load of questions about how do they do business, what type of business vertical do they sit in, and we ask them about cybersecurity problems. So we say, have you been attacked? Did it cost you money? What are the key areas of interest that you need to look for? What do you need to solve for? And we've been tracking the responses over the past sort of 5 to 6 years, and there's a few stats that have really stood out. And one of them is this one at the top here. 3/4 of all the businesses we speak to in the past 5 years have had a financially impacting attack. That means that they've been victim of an attack and it's cost them money. Now, we do see these kind of stats in other places, but I think to Aaron's point earlier, people underreport. We don't see them in any of this sort of same consistency. People might say, "Oh yeah, we had an attack, didn't cost us anything. Yeah, we solved that. No data was taken," and they're not always telling the truth. And studies like this, where we're saying, you're anonymous, you can tell us what's really happened, we get the truth out of people. And often the problem is far bigger than people are reporting. We also have them feeding back things like saying, look, we need the help, we need support in these practices, but we don't have complete trust in our technology provider to actually do that. And that's part of the reason why we get on things like these webinars. So we, in the security space, we need to be transparent. We need to have these conversations. We need to understand what your risks are. We need to understand what your concerns are. So by having these conversations, by having these webinars, by having these events, by following up with your account managers afterwards, this is how we ensure there is transparency and communication. Because ultimately, good cybersecurity is going to come down to communication, both us helping you guide with things like how to address your risks, and you telling us what's really important to you as a business. We're going to take a look at how cybercrime has been evolving, what some of the key changes are, and what the impact is. Now, the first people I'm going to talk about is a Verizon study, and Verizon do a global study based on when there have been threats. They look at things like where was the initial access? So how did they gain access to your environment or your device or your user account before maybe they committed some form of crime? And the top 4 for Europe, Middle East, and Africa was the use of stolen credentials. So that's credential compromise. So those dark web scans that are telling you you've got credentials online, that's ultimately what those credentials get used for, is attacking you with using valid accounts. Next one is phishing. Phishing can perpetrate a number of types of attack. It can have links that you can follow, which might download malware. It could be part of a social engineering attack, which we can see it comes under the other category, where we're actually just trying to get information out of you, or we're trying to determine how you do business. And then we've got things like backdoors, and command and control servers and things like botnets, stuff that sits in your environment that you don't know about, which is reporting back. So we know that those are kind of the initial access vectors. What type of threats are most common? Well, I'm going to show a report. This is a UK-based report, but it's quite relevant because it's a report from the NCSC, and they heavily support the public sector. And they also have to monitor and maintain people's privacy concerns. So when people have a privacy incident, and under GDPR law, they have to report it. They have to report it to the ICO in the UK. And the NCSC look at all of those reports, and from that they build out what are the most common types for attacks. Not all privacy incidents are attacks, but a number of them are. So we see some good information on that. And we see that ransomware is one of the biggest attack forms, and business email compromise. They've been the two biggest for quite a number of years now. But we're seeing other things creep in. We're seeing supply chain compromise. We're seeing exploitation of vulnerabilities. We're seeing targeted attacks by hostile nation states. So with the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, there is an increased focus of attacks, predominantly between those two countries right now. So at the moment, most of the attacks are Ukraine targeted at Russia and Russia targeted at Ukraine. However, there is some spillover because whenever there's that type of attacks going on, they're not always specific about their targets. The WannaCry attack, for instance, many years ago now, was a targeted attack at Ukraine. It ended up impacting people globally overnight. You know, we can have these attacks spill over. We've also seen that Russia has said that, you know, anybody that wants to attack the West, you will look after you. We'll support you. We'll make sure nobody can get to you. Right. So there's increased activity around that. We know that hostile nation states are one of the major attack vectors. Typically, there's two. So hostile nation states targeting critical national infrastructure, CNI, and they're going after healthcare, they're going after energy sector, public sector, transport, finance, and they try and disrupt nations. So when Russia is saying we're going after the West, what they're trying to do is disrupt. Yeah, of course, there will be a financial impact, but it's not their main motivation. Their main motivation is political. In relation to that, we know that there is a large number of potential other critical national infrastructure or part of the supply chain which fall into that. And typically a lot of these are smaller businesses that feed into that critical national infrastructure. So just because you are a smaller business doesn't mean you're not going to be part of that. We do recognise, though, and statistically we recognise this, that actually for smaller businesses, so that SMB size business, your primary attack is going to be the financially motivated ones. And they're going to be either your ransomware and your business email compromise. But we're seeing ransomware specifically, 70% of attacks now are targeted at the small to medium sized businesses. If I rewind 3-4 years ago, it was more like 30% of the attacks and the rest were all at large enterprise. But the space has changed. Yeah, the space has changed. Threat actor groups are going after smaller targets, and there's a number of reasons. So one of the reasons is the fact that they've been able to commoditize this. They've turned it into a business model. So we have developers that sit at the top of this business model as ransomware as a service, and we have affiliates, which are people that can sign up, and pretty much all you need to do is go on the dark web, look for a ransomware group. They will provide you with the services, the tools, the training, and everything you need to go and attack somebody and exfiltrate money from there. So encrypt their information, exfiltrate their data, hold them for ransom, and I'll instruct you how to do that. They then have a model where you can pay a monthly subscription, or you can have a one-time license fee or profit share, and the rest of the money goes to the ransomware group. So the ransomware group makes a lot of money out of this, but they don't have to hit as big targets. They can hit multiple smaller targets. And they're also doing things like, there's big money in this. They've got bug bounty programs. They're looking for somebody that might tell them about a threat, and they're offering anything up to $1 million. Now, as I said, one of the reasons why the threat has changed, so from away from large business to small business, is partly this business model has allowed it. The other part is that some of the threat actor groups are being targeted now, especially if they go after large enterprise. We had a particularly large attack against Colonial Pipeline, and that was in May 2021, I believe, and that prompted the US government to really go after threat actors. And a number of the groups just turned around and said, like, overnight, we're not going after large enterprise. Many have returned to chasing large enterprise, but you get situations like this. I'm just going to share an image. Mikhail Pavlovic, currently wanted by the FBI for $10 million. So there's a bounty on his head now. And why is there a bounty on his head? Because he helped two of the ransomware groups, Lockbit and Hive. And Hive recently went on a spree where they targeted healthcare. And that is really the main reason why they're now on this watch list, and there's a huge bounty on them. And we have seen multiple times actually their own threat actor groups give them up because the money's too enticing. Yeah, so no honor amongst thieves, right? If you are impacted, what does that look like? And you sometimes see stats which are monetary based, and they throw out these big numbers and say, yeah, the average is 200 million or some ridiculous number. And the problem with it is where they're looking at a very small subset of the threats. B, not everybody reports the threats, so only see the big ones that are the big ones that are reported. So we want to look at some more interesting stats that are a bit more representative. So the ones we look at are things like dwell time. So how long on average, when a threat has been initiated and we do the research to find out what the root cause was and how they got in, how long did they have access to our environment? And on average, for ransomware is 23 days. So they're in their environments for some significant time before they're actually pulling the trigger on the threat. They're using that time to do reconnaissance. They're using that time to work out how much money you make. They're using this time to understand what data do you hold? Who are your customers? Can I target your customers as well? Can I leverage money out of them? And ultimately, if they do hold you to ransom, and they might encrypt your data, they might just exfiltrate your data, which means they just take a copy and then hold you for ransom and say, we're going to release this private information and it's going to damage your reputation. Different methods they'll use, right? But whatever they're looking for, typically they're going to ransom up to 10% of your annual revenue. That's going to be the cost you the immediate cost. It's not the overall cost though. If you do pay the ransom, don't pay the ransom, you're going to have downtime. You're going to have downtime either way. If you pay the ransom, you're still going to have downtime while you recover. You might recover a little bit quicker. And by the way, it's only 66% of data that is encrypted by ransomware can be recovered. So you never get everything back. So that's worth mentioning as well. So even if you pay the ransom, you don't get everything back. So you've got a lot of time in terms of getting your business back up and running to where it was before. On average, it's 21 days. So that represents the rest of the cost. So the other 80% of the cost is your downtime, it's your reputational impact, it's a loss of sales. In fact, you can't make any money while this is happening. All of this information, I'd say, is quite important to you, especially if you're looking at things like insurance, making sure you're covering yourselves appropriately for insurance sums. So if you are looking at that insurance avenue, it's important to note as well that insurance companies understand the same things. Whilst they don't really understand cyber very well, they're not a specialist in cyber, they are a specialist in data. And they support a whole load of companies in which they have cyber policies with. They know that there are typical profiles that a company fits in, which makes them more or less risky. They've been changing their policies and they've been mandating things like EDR, instant response, security awareness training, the ability to log, because they know that companies that follow these technologies or service or tools or approaches are much less likely to be impacted. And when they are, the cost is lower. So you're seeing these things for a reason, and insurance space is a little bit confused at the moment. Some companies are saying, no, we don't want to insure you, but other companies are really taking the bull by the horn and saying, look, we can insure you, it's fine. We just need to make sure you have the appropriate controls so that the likelihood of attack is lower. We're going to look next at why does security fail? So I'm going to give some examples of why security might fail. So I'm going to take a look at MFA and why MFA might fail, because MFA has been utilized as this way of looking after our accounts, and it does do a good job. It is a security control that everybody should be utilizing, but it's not 100%. and you'll see a common theme with pretty much everything in security. If you have the right know-how, knowledge, and time, everything can be bypassed. So we have to think of the principle of layering our security, because it's not always going to be about the individual approach. So this particular one is looking at an evil proxy attack. So in this attack, we have a user. They are trying to maybe get onto their website. They've received an email that says, hey, you need to update some settings in Office. So this is our target website. They follow that email, but they're not going to Office. They're going to a phishing website that looks remarkably like Office, has a similar looking URL, has exactly the same visuals on the screen, and they start entering their credentials in. This is also known as a man-in-the-middle attack. And what's happening here is that you are entering your credentials into this site, and that they are entering the credentials into your genuine valid site. So what's happening is your site is reporting back and going, right, I'm going to encrypt the session. We've got a safe session now. This is a HTTPS or TLS encrypted session. You've input your username and password, and the phishing sites forward your credentials. The valid site prompts for MFA. The bogus site prompts for MFA. You fill out the MFA. The bogus site hijacks that, forwards the MFA input to your target site Office. Office returns a session cookie, not to you, to the attacker. You've now just authorized that attacker's machine to access your account. And they've got access to your account for as long as the session cookie lasts. And this kind of summed it up. We've got a single control, and if people understand that's the only control you've got, then they'll be able to bypass it. This is a more real world example. We have a single control. We have a barrier on the road. Not particularly difficult to see how you bypass that one. You can see many people have. They've just driven around it. Yeah, we haven't got layered security. We haven't thought about what's the wider use case. So good security, we need to think about those layers, and we need to think about people, process, and technology. There have been fundamentals in security for a sort of significant period of time, but people do forget about them sometimes. They go, right, what's the latest AI tool? I'm going to get the best technology. And then they don't think about doing any security awareness training. They don't think about the processes behind using them. They don't think about instant response. And what do you get? You get gaps. So if I pick just the technology, like I said, I'm going to end up with shelfware. Nobody's going to know how to use it. And when they do use it, they're all going to use it completely differently. And it's going to be completely inconsistent. If I've got people and process, so I've trained my people, I have processes all for them, they all know what they're going to do, they're all going to do a good job. But at the point where they suddenly have to deal with 10 times as many inquiries as they normally would do, they can't scale that up. They haven't got the technology to allow them to scale or automate or handle more. So we've got a burden to scale. So there's always a downside if we aren't thinking about all three. And some of the downsides are listed there. Now it brings us on to what does good look like. So we take those principles of people, process, and technology, and we go a step further, and we think about cybersecurity frameworks. And cybersecurity frameworks are controls that you can use in your organization that are going to help you address security risk. They are aimed at addressing cybersecurity risk across your whole organization, not just a small part of it. And they also cover things like, how are you training people? Are there roles and responsibility? Are there established processes? So they are thinking about those three: people, process, and technology pieces. On the initial side, there's 5 functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. We start at identify, and we determine what are the assets in your company that you need to look after. What's the important assets to you? Now, if you're in a financial industry, ultimately the records and the private data that you deal with is what earns you the money. That's what you do as a company. You're working the finances around people's personal information and around individuals and or individual transactions. If you're in a company that does manufacturing, then your manufacturing plant is what earns you the money. That's probably the most important part of your business. So there's going to be different areas of your business that are going to have different value to you. So identification is about working out what are those parts of the business, what has the most value to me, what budget can I attribute to them, and then how do I protect them? We then move on to the protection piece. So we look at the risks to those identified assets and we try to protect them from being compromised. We look at maybe an endpoint technology like EDR. We'll maybe look at email security to protect your data. We'll look at the availability of the systems. How do we make sure your systems keep on running? And you might have things like power backups, for instance. There could be some physical stuff we go down to. Moving on from that, though, we need to look at and consider, what if all of that fails? What if someone gets past that? How do we detect compromise? Right? Now, from a physical side of things, you might have an alarm if your electricity cuts out, right? A battery backed up alarm that goes off if your electricity goes off, notifies everybody. That's an example of a detection based solution. You might have security cameras. Yeah, there are different ways of detecting compromise, and we have technology ways of doing that as well, and typically involve people monitoring as well. We then move on to response. So once we've determined someone's come through, how do we respond effectively to minimize the impact? Yeah, if I can detect someone early, I'm not waiting 21 days, because at 21 days on average, they're hitting that ransomware button. If I can get them on day 3, for instance, they might have compromised a machine, might have compromised a couple of machines, but we've limited the impact. You can still carry on functioning as a business. Potentially that financial impact is not going to shut you down as a business. Yeah, so we've minimized that risk down to an acceptable level. And then we've got recovery, which is what do we do when everything has gone wrong? How can we get back up to a working state as quickly as possible? And that might include things like taking backups and how you recover those backups. It could include having another office location to go to. Varying different ways of tackling it. So moving on to a real world example, we've used a house. And we're going to look at those. We're going to compare sort of that physical security I started talking about. So I have a house and I want to stop people from getting in. So I have a door and a lock. It's going to stop the majority of people, the people are just sort of wandering by. They're not going to just be able to walk into my house. Now, technology wise, that's very similar to a firewall and antivirus. That's the sort of typical level of protection you're looking at with firewall or antivirus. You're going to stop the most general attempts at getting into your environment. For an office location, though, you are often going to invest a little bit more money in the security, and you can think about some of the other areas and ways people can get into your building. You're going to think about having break glass sensors on the windows, maybe. You're going to have an alarm system. You might have security cameras in the building and around the building. And then the security cameras are going to record information, but that alarm security cameras might be connected to a guard that's monitoring, who can then come and respond if something goes wrong. Okay, so we've reduced the chances of somebody getting into our environment without us knowing about it. And we've got the ability to respond. In technology wise, that's similar to implementing an EDR tool, a logging monitoring tool, and utilizing a SOC service to be that responsive team that can then respond and know about an attack if it's occurred. Yeah. So we start layering up some of our security, and we've got a much higher likelihood that we're going to catch somebody and prevent them from doing any serious harm now. You can apply those principles to cyber defense matrix. So this is a NIST cyber defense matrix, and we put the various stages of that cyber framework. So the cyber framework we looked at was NIST. You can use NIST, or you can use ISO 27001, or you can use CIS controls. They are all very similar. They've all got the same principle. They are controls for your company to help you deal with risk. So then we can start layering up products. When we can go sort of as far as you like, as far as your budget might take you. The more layering you get, the less likelihood you are going to get attacked, and the smaller the impact. But you've got to prioritize, right? And that's why identification is so important. In terms of data responsibility, so when you're looking at your assets, you're looking at a risk, and you're thinking, I want to share some of that risk, I want to work with somebody. Well, ultimately, you are the data owner. So you're the person that establishes the budget of protecting that data. And unfortunately, you can't directly share the risk with your IT provider. What you are doing is you're using them as an expert consultant, or you're potentially using them to keep your environment running. If you want to share the risk, the only way of sharing risk is through insurance. And what you're doing there is you're saying that we mutually agree that you have a risk to the company. We're going to agree what controls you're going to put in place. And should you be impacted, we're going to help pay for that. And that's sharing risk. With your IT provider, you are purchasing a service to help look after your infrastructure, and maybe look after your data. So they're ensuring that you're using appropriate tech, it's kept up to date, you're maintaining the availability of those services. If they are also your security provider, they'll also be providing recommendations and going through assessment and saying, based on your company, these are the areas we think you should try to look after. But ultimately, remember, that budget and liability comes down to you. So the better communication you have in this, the better value you'll be getting out of this. It's the same regardless of who you go to. So, I mean, things you can do today, as per my previous slide, you need to understand what your risk is. If you don't, then do a cyber assessment. Yeah. Work with your provider, work with your IT provider, to understand what the risks are to your business. They can help work through security frameworks. They can help work in partnership and identify where potentially you've got gaps. We know you don't have unlimited budget. So it's about making that work the best for you. And then maybe understanding where you have to increase budget based on risk maybe you didn't know about as a company. Ultimately, though, security is a journey. It's something we're going to revisit. It's not just a one and done. We've got to keep on looking at this. We will need to assess. We'll need to go through a roadmap journey. In a year's time, we'll maybe need to look at all of this again and create another 12-month roadmap. Periodically, we'll want to review at least quarterly, understand where you're going. We're trying to reduce your risk and we're trying to keep it there. We can only do that if we keep on talking. That's the end of my session today, and I can open out to any questions. Hope you appreciate that, and yeah, happy to cover any questions on anything we talked about or anything we didn't talk about today.
That's great. Thanks very much, Lee. Really appreciate it. I've got a couple of notes that I was jotting down here, but instead of doing that, I'd love to hear from the floor. So, guys, anything Lee brought up specifically? I thought that information about ransomware as a service pretty frightening. What's available out there? Obviously, all of us knew it was out there, but what's happened in the last 24 months is pretty frightening, especially when you look at nation states and what nation states are doing, and that concept of spillover. It's not like Russia's coming after you as an individual, but we know what they're doing north of us, and that spillover is pretty serious and is now somewhat of a proven fact. So any questions? Everyone just waiting for tequila. Come on, guys. I know we're going to have lots of questions around the tequila, but aren't we here for cybersecurity?
I think there were some questions that came through at the RSVPs as well. I think if any of those weren't answered, maybe we can kick off with those while everyone's coming up with their own questions.
That's great. Cool. Mel, I think we do have one. Here we go. JP's got one, and then Brian's 100% right. We do have some others that were raised earlier. But JP.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, so my one, I've actually got two questions. So do you incorporate the MITRE ATT&CK framework at all? And secondly, how do you accommodate for IoT and OT security? So in a lot of spaces, there's a huge focus on IT security, for example, especially end user base and so forth. But around the IoT/OT, like a PLC in your manufacturing plant, CCTV cameras, etc., that one normally overlooks, right? How do you approach securing that, identifying that, etc.? So I've recently been through an exercise. I would just like to get your input on how you would typically approach that and how you incorporate that into your solution.
Yeah, do you want me to cover some of that? Or
Yeah, great. Lee?
yeah, can do. So I'll start with the MITRE framework. So the MITRE framework is specifically used by a number of the technologies we use. So the EDR solution utilizes the MITRE framework in the background because the MITRE framework describes the tactics, techniques, and procedures used by threat actors. We have a SOC team as well and a threat intelligence team, and they actually do a lot of work with MITRE directly. And what happens is, because of the size of our SOC team, they're around sort of 200 plus, about 200 plus people now. We're seeing a significant number of the global attacks. We've become such a sort of large player that actually we have a relationship with Microsoft where they're telling us about their vulnerabilities early, and we're looking for compromise those vulnerabilities and feeding back to them so they can patch stuff. And we have relationships with people like MITRE where we're saying, hey, we're seeing this new attack technique. You've got to update your attack techniques. And we're equally getting information back the other way. But yes, it is very heavily ingrained in all of the technologies and the services. That's the first part.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Second part, IoT, OT, it's all about layers again. So many of the technologies have functionality which can help give you visibility. So for instance, I could get full of visibility of an IoT OT network if I'm using SIEM and I'm monitoring the network, right? I can take some steps where I can segregate those devices off to networks that maybe not as high a priority. So I can say all of my security cameras, all of my IoT devices, they're all going to sit on a separate network that doesn't interact with my data. So I immediately remove the risk or reduce the risk that if one of those devices are compromised, it can't physically access my corporate devices, right? OT devices, typically you want them segregated completely. You don't want them online. Now, I spoke to a provider not too long ago that wanted to do remote control into all of their mining equipment. And I said, okay, but you really shouldn't be doing that remotely across the internet. That needs to be a private local network. And even if you are going to be remote, it needs to be a man in a hut, not someone from your corporate office. Otherwise, you're going to kill people.
Yeah.
I think the SIEM adds value from a perspective where you're in a more mature environment or a specifically smaller environment. We're actually aware of all the IoT/OT devices, right? If you know about all the cameras, all the PLCs, all the meters, etc., that gets used across the business. Something that we've recently seen is that there's so many IoT devices that you're actually not aware of, right? Is that it's actually worth going through discovery in order to actually understand what have you got, what are your vulnerabilities, and how do you actually go about protecting them?
Yeah, no, you're right. And most of those solutions, what they'll work on, and we've got a few solutions that can do that type of monitoring, is they'll monitor the network traffic and they'll monitor the destination and where the traffic's arriving from. And we'll pick up all the IoT devices from that respect because we'll see them as a target. We've got solutions as well, which will also block the malicious traffic. So before it's able to get to that device, if it's, say, for instance, we see, I talked about command and control server. Yeah, that's a server maybe sitting in North Korea or sitting in Russia, and that's going to upload malware or that's going to upload malicious content, or it's going to try and turn that IoT device into a botnet, which is then going to distribute. We can see that network traffic. We can block that network traffic. Yeah, so there are services and tools out that we can use that can do that as well. But yeah, ultimately it is about the layers.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate that. I think, did we have another hand pop up after JP, or should we go to our remote questions? Mel, Jess, did you see anything else there? No,
I didn't
That's-
see anything.
yeah, just share that. I think the first question was around AI.
Yeah, so there was a lot of questions around AI. Everyone seems keen, and that is why Lee included that special section in the beginning. But one of the first one is ChatGPT and related AI tools are interesting, but how can they realistically improve cybersecurity to detect cyber threats quickly and accurately?
ChatGPT specifically, it's language learning models, so it's more about your support technicians. So, for instance, if I saw a threat and I had information come from my agent that says this has been accessed, this has been accessed, I could compare that to a large language model, which would tell me that this particular set of syntax and string has most commonly be seen in this form of attack. And then it would feed me back remediation. So that's one potential use case, right, for a generative AI system. But generative AI isn't just language models. It's any type of machine learning. It's any type of pattern recognition. And security is typically all about patterns. So most of the security products have already got machine learning, AI, and some of them have got generative AI built in. It's just not large language models. That's the one that's kind of burst on the scene, and everybody has gone, oh wow, I can utilize this because they're quite good for productivity. But in the background, we've had machine learning departments working in AI for as long as, or working in sort of cybersecurity for a good part of 10 years, I would say, plus. You know, how long ago did I go to university? I took an AI module at university. That's a good 20 years ago now.
And I think the next one sort of closely touches on that as well, which is someone mentioning the concept of machine learning being involved for quite a long period of time. How is that now changing in the last 2 or 3 years? All of a sudden, you know, this current generation of AI, are we looking at a very steep curve of how dramatically everyone is going to be at risk because of what's going on right now?
Yeah, so we're using the same models that threat actors are using to become more effective. We're looking for those trends using the same technologies. So example here, I'm a threat actor. My English language isn't particularly good, so I'm going to use a large language model to translate what I want, a phishing message, and make a much more convincing phishing message. Well, if I am an anti-phishing spam model, I can use those same large language models to find out what that is typically going to look like, and then just block those. So it's kind of we're using the same technology that threat actors will be using to generate malicious code or content, and then we're using those same models to give us the same results to protect against them. And in fact, I've seen companies run threat scenarios where they've generated code using a large language model, then generated a threat that can exploit it, and then generated some way of protecting it as well, all using the large language model. So you end up in this arms race which never ends.
Yeah, that's how the robots get us, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Another
Awesome.
one? Mm.
And then the last one was I see Carl, who's going to be taking us through our tequila, just joined. But can you
Welcome,
explain the
Carl.
role of AI in automating or streamlining incident response to cybersecurity events, or perhaps how it could improve cyber resilience?
Yeah, so cyber resilience wise, you can use AI to look for trends. So if you're in certain types of business and verticals, because it is a pattern recognition tool, we can look, for example, if you're in the shipping industry, we can look for these particular types you're most likely to be vulnerable to it. So that's one potential way you could use AI to get to that. I'm not saying all these things are available right now, I'm just speculating in terms of what we can use in terms of AI. The other part is in terms of efficiency, and I alluded to it. It's about identifying keywords. It's about identifying related information. A lot of analytical work is about trying to provide context and correlating information. And we're working with huge data sets. So if a data set includes 1 million logs, for instance, an AI model will help us correlate those logs and find 2 relevant logs that relate to each other. And we'll do that much quicker using AI-based tools.
And then, something else from my side is I always find the approach to layered security is one that's, perhaps most easily understood by executives and C-suites. So I think, everyone in the room, again, all IT professionals, all running IT departments in some way, shape, or form, and a wide array of company sizes as well in the room, which is also quite cool. So I think some of you are going to be far further along your journey than others. But the one thing that I think is common amongst all of us is how difficult it is to get sign off on budget when it comes to broadening your protection. And I think that's again, it's something common that we all struggle with. And to me, we play a large role there in just helping IT departments have those conversations. And I think that was key in what Lee was touching on with layered security. Again, that seems to be the most easy to understand, is whenever we're presenting these budgets, they're constantly increasing. So, what I'm interested in, and I think we'll continue to unpack this with a lot of you, and Kamaran's team will run this next week and onwards. We're going to be talking to you guys just about helping you in that sort of roadmap. So where are you now? How much are you doing? Is there budget available? And if not, what's the budget next year? What's the budget the year after? And I think so. A question for me to Lee is, how is this dealt with internationally? Is there a standard? How do we approach that conversation? What is the standard for understanding risk and value and associating that to what budget should be set for these things?
Yeah, sure. So if I take a framework approach, so a cybersecurity framework approach, one of the first things we have is the identify, and that's working out what your assets are. And the reason why we do that is to determine what budget you need. So one of the first steps is I do an inventory of all of my assets. I determine an owner for each of them, and the owner might be a business unit, for instance. And then we are trying to establish risks against those, and we also ask the business unit to value it as well. Is this a high value asset? Is this a low value asset? Is this a zero value asset? In which case, why is it there? Now, the purpose of this actually is, one, we can free up budget. We find a whole load of things, data and assets or systems, and actually nobody owns it. Nobody has any value for it. Why is it there? It's costing you money needlessly. Okay, so that's the first piece. We can save some budget there. Second piece is business units will look at it and go, yeah, is this valuable to me? Now, typically, first run you do this, business units will always go, it's all valuable to me, or I'll rate it at this rate. When you relay the message, actually the budget to protect those things needs to come out of their business unit, you get a more accurate impression of what is actually valuable and what isn't. And that's typically how you would approach it, is you would identify the assets in the company. They all have a value, they produce money for the company, and then you have an appropriate budget related to that for each business unit.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, again, speaking to the audience and everyone here representing a business of a different size, if you're a smaller business, the person representing that business is a sole director or a CEO or an MD, and they need to answer that asset question. And they're probably going to see where you're coming from if you pose the question. As the business grows, and to Lee's point, they're going to be business unit managers, and they're going to need to speak to the assets or the IP in each of their business. And again, you as the IT manager or the CIO needs to ask those questions, and I think put those people on the spot. It's certainly something we've seen in our lives in Turrito, is our customers are the IT department. And we're realizing that more and more as these threats increase and as businesses become more technologically advanced. I think most of you in the room, at least half of you, have been our customers for many, many years now, which is great. So you've seen us grow from what we were to what we now are as a sort of technology service provider. But your departments have grown and your budgets have grown because the risks have grown as well. And I think it's an interesting journey, but it's time that you're pushing back, that you need to push this sort of stress and cost consideration onto departments, and ask those questions, because what we've seen again, there's a part of IT support that becomes covering our own asses, and that's an honest truth when you're running an IT department. You need to put those things in the budget. You need to highlight the risk to business. And if business doesn't put the corresponding cost into the budget, you need to be on record if something does happen by saying, listen, I recommended an approach to layered security. And that approach to layered security was 10 solutions. Budget allowed me for 5 of those. We're obviously missing a few, and guess what? We had an impact, and it came from this area that we weren't properly policing. But I raised it in my quarterly review. I raised it in my annual review. So sure, let me help you fix it. But don't tell me and my IT team that we're all going to be retrenched because the name of the corporation is now being dragged through the mud because of a terrible event. So I think that's key. And again, it's something we can help you all with. So we'll be in touch next week and the week after, and happy to have more of these conversations.
We've got a question that came through from James, Aaron.
Yeah.
Which is there a way of calculating the cost on not protecting? And I suppose a plausible one, because everyone will lean towards, the cost is massive. It's definitely worth it. But methodologies to look at the way to show that to the business and help them understand it.
There is indeed. So there's a couple of ways you look at it. It's quantitative and qualitative cost analysis. Quantitative is fairly simple. I have an asset, it has a value in terms of it's a physical device. It costs me this much to replace it. Those are the easy ones. Yeah. So I have a laptop. If that laptop is destroyed or compromised, it's going to cost me X to replace it. And the qualitative ones are a little bit more tricky, and they do sometimes involve you working out what the relationship is between the item and how you make money. And typically that's how you quantify them. So when we talked about that, when we talked about the manufacturing side of it, if it's a person, so if that person was not able to do work, and people are assets as well, what value do they provide which keeps the manufacturing plant running? Would their lack of presence stop that from working? And thus, how much would that cost you every minute, hour, whatever it might be? There is other ways of looking at it as well, and that is things like what's the reputational damage, and that's another qualitative type of way of looking at things. There's additionally as well, you can look in terms of, there are some baselines for things like personal information. So personal information, if personal information gets into the wild, on average, it's supposed to cost you in the region of $150 to $200 per record. If that gets into the wild, and that's things like your legal liability, everything else around it. So that's another way of building up some of that financial record. Or you can take the approach of, what are my chances of a ransomware attack? And I know how much they're going to charge me on a ransomware attack. I know how much my downtime is going to cost me. Hence, I want to minimize that as much as possible.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Lee. All right, guys. Without further ado, I don't know if you guys have poured your tequila into glasses, but I have, so I'm getting a bit lightheaded. And I think we need to move on. So, Lee, thank you very much. That was informative, as always. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And I think at this stage we can hand over. All right.
Thanks, Lee.
Hi guys, is that straight into me?
Yeah, that's straight into you.
Fantastic, man. Yes, yes. No break needed. Just straight right.
Oh, that's a very good point, actually. Maybe we should take a break. Everyone's been sitting for about an hour now, and we're about to drink tequila.
I'm relaxed. You want to have a few minutes? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Let's just give everyone a couple of minutes, guys. So head off to the bathroom or for a smoke, or for a chaser. Coombs pointed out earlier we might need a chaser if we're doing a tequila tasting. I don't know if Carl strongly disagrees with that.
No, do what you got to do, but
Right.
I'm hoping you won't need it. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, guys. So get a glass of water.